On the morning of December 7, 1941, Sunday began like any other for thousands of American sailors anchored in Hawaii. The sun rose calmly over the harbor. The water was almost still. Many men were still asleep. Others were already awake, thinking about coffee, letters from home, or small routines that had nothing to do with war. For them, Pearl Harbor was not a battlefield. It was a safe harbor. The ships lay quietly along what was known as Battleship Row. Massive battleships rested side by side, engines shut down, crews reduced because it was Sunday. Anti-aircraft guns, for the most part, were not fully manned. The idea of a surprise attack felt distant, almost impossible. Among the sailors, the war was something happening far away. In Europe, in the Atlantic, on the other side of the world. Even with growing tensions with Japan, few believed the first blow would fall there, inside an American base in the middle of the morning. And then at 7:48 a.m., the sky began to scream. For many men on board, the first sound was not recognized as an attack. Some thought it was an exercise. Others assumed American aircraft were maneuvering overhead. Only when the explosions began, sharp, violent, far too close, did understanding arrive, fast and brutal. This was not training. This was war. From the decks, sailors saw aircraft with red suns painted on their wings diving at low altitude. They saw bombs falling almost in slow motion before impact. They saw torpedoes cutting through the water toward motionless hulls. In seconds, the most important port in the Pacific turned into an inferno of fire, smoke, and twisted metal. Inside the ships, the experience was even more chaotic. Men were thrown against steel bulkheads. Lights went out. Alarms began to sound too late. Compartments flooded without warning. Many sailors woke up with their ship already under attack without even knowing who was attacking, or why. No one had a complete picture of what was happening. Each man lived Pearl Harbor through fragments. A corridor filled with smoke. A deck covered in shrapnel. A ladder blocked by fire. A friend who was there seconds before, and then wasn't. This documentary is not the story of the attack seen from above, through maps and reports. It is the story of Pearl Harbor told by the men who were on the ships. Men who ran to guns that were still cold. Who tried to save shipmates trapped below deck. Who jumped into burning water without knowing if they would survive. Who watched their ships sink in the very place they believed was safe. Throughout this narrative, we will follow the attack minute by minute, not from the perspective of commanders or aircraft, but through the eyes of those inside the steel, living chaos without context, without warning, and without time to understand. Because for those men, Pearl Harbor did not begin with a declaration of war. It began with a quiet Sunday morning, and ended with the certainty that the world had changed forever. It is from this first impact, when the sky falls onto the ships, that we move forward now. For the men aboard the ships, the first minutes were lived in a state of pure shock. There was no time to think about strategy, politics, or consequences. There was only the instinctive reaction to survive. On many battleships, sailors ran onto the decks still wearing sleep clothes. Others emerged from internal compartments filled with smoke, not knowing exactly where to go. Orders arrived in fragments, when they arrived at all. Officers shouted commands that could barely be heard over the roar of aircraft engines and explosions. On the USS Oklahoma, the attack was devastating from the very first moments. Torpedoes struck the hull on the port side in rapid succession. For the men inside the ship, the sensation was a violent shove followed by a growing list. The floor stopped being a floor. What had been a wall became the ceiling. Some sailors managed to escape by running through corridors while the ship was still slowly moving. Others were trapped in compartments that began to fill with dark, oily water. Desperate pounding was heard for hours afterward, coming from air pockets inside the overturned hull. Not all of them could be reached in time. Just a few meters away, aboard the USS West Virginia, the scene was different, but no less hellish. The ship was hit by multiple torpedoes and bombs, tearing massive holes below the waterline. Damage control crews fought to contain flooding while fires spread across the deck. There, many sailors continued to man anti-aircraft guns even as the ship slowly sank beneath their feet. Some fired almost point-blank at Japanese aircraft flying so low that the pilots could be seen clearly. The dominant feeling was not conscious heroism, it was reaction. Doing something. Anything. Because standing still meant dying. On the USS Arizona, the experience was abrupt and final for many. When an armor-piercing bomb struck the forward ammunition magazines, the explosion was so violent that the ship seemed to tear itself apart. For sailors near the impact, there was no pain, no time to understand. For those farther away, there was a blinding flash, a shockwave, and then silence, broken only by fire and screams. Some survivors later said the heat was immediate and suffocating. Others recalled being thrown into the water without realizing how they had left the ship. Where a battleship had stood moments before, there were now flames, burning oil on the surface, and debris falling from the sky. Across all the ships, the same pattern repeated itself. Initial confusion. A desperate attempt to react. And the growing realization that this was not an isolated attack. The sky was too full. The explosions too close. The targets too numerous. For the sailors, it quickly became clear that Pearl Harbor as a whole was under attack. Men ran to anti-aircraft guns they had never fired in real combat. Many had no ammunition ready. Others were unsure how to operate the systems under fire. Still, shots began to rise in every direction, filling the sky with tracer fire and smoke. Each ship became its own world of chaos. On one, the fight was against fire. On another, against rising water. On another, against time, to save those still trapped below. No one knew how long the attack would last. No one knew if there would be a second wave, or a third. No one knew if this was only the beginning. What everyone knew, even without saying it, was simple and terrifying. They were on their own. And the war had come to them. In the moments that followed, we will see how these men, without warning, without full preparation, kept fighting, helping one another, and making decisions that separated life from death in a matter of seconds. Because for those aboard the ships, Pearl Harbor was not a historical event. It was a sequence of choices made in the middle of fire. As the minutes passed, something changed among the men aboard the ships. The initial shock gave way to a brutal clarity. Either they reacted or they would be destroyed where they stood. Amid the chaos, sailors began to organize almost by instinct. Anti-aircraft guns were manned by whoever was closest: cooks, radio operators, mechanics. Many had never fired those weapons in real combat. Some had barely completed their training. Still, they learned in seconds, making mistakes and correcting them under enemy fire. On the USS Nevada, one of the most striking scenes of the attack unfolded. Unlike most of the battleships, Nevada managed to raise steam and attempt to leave Battleship Row. For the sailors aboard, it felt like a chance, small but real, to escape the slaughter. As the ship moved slowly forward, Japanese aircraft concentrated their attacks on it. Bombs exploded nearby, shrapnel swept across the deck, and still Nevada pressed on. For a few minutes, many crewmen believed they might get the ship out of the harbor and prevent it from sinking and blocking the channel. When it became clear that the battleship had turned into a dangerously exposed moving target, the order came that no one wanted to hear: beach the ship. Nevada was deliberately run aground, avoiding an even greater disaster. To the sailors, it did not feel like defeat, it felt like calculated survival. Meanwhile, across the harbor, human scenes multiplied. Men jumped into water covered with burning oil, knowing that staying aboard the ships was even worse. Some managed to swim to shore. Others were pulled out by small boats moving under continuous fire. Many could barely swim. Some were already wounded. They entered the water anyway because there was no other choice. In several places, sailors from different ships helped one another without knowing names or ranks. Ropes were thrown. Hands were reached out. Wounded men were dragged to relatively safer spots while the attack continued overhead. Time seemed distorted. For some, everything happened too fast, a non-stop chain of explosions. For others, every second felt endless. Later accounts make this contradiction clear. Pearl Harbor was experienced in completely different ways, even by men who were only meters apart. The second wave of attacks arrived while many were still trying to understand the first. Aircraft dove again, striking already damaged ships, shore installations, and airfields. For the sailors, this was perhaps the most desperate moment. Any hope that it's over was crushed. Still, the guns kept firing. Some men would later remember forever the constant metallic noise, not just the explosions but the impact of their own guns firing, the smell of gunpowder mixed with burning oil, the smoke that made their eyes burn. Many only realized they were wounded when the attack began to fade and adrenaline gave way to pain. Shortly before 9 in the morning, the Japanese aircraft began to pull away. There was no announcement, no clear signal. Just the sound of engines fading until the sky felt strange, empty. For the men aboard the ships, that silence was almost as disturbing as the attack itself. No one celebrated. No one shouted victory. What remained was smoke rising from shattered ships, water covered with debris and bodies, and men stumbling across surviving decks, trying to understand who was still alive. Pearl Harbor had lasted just over an hour. But for those who were there, it felt like a lifetime. And the day was only just beginning. When the aircraft disappeared over the horizon, there was no feeling of an ending. For the men aboard the ships, another battle began, silent, heavy, made of impossible choices. The air was still thick with smoke. The smell of burning oil clung to skin and lungs. In several parts of the harbor, fires continued to burn without immediate control. And among the wreckage were living men, wounded, trapped, dazed, who needed help now. Inside the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma, a sound began to repeat itself in a deeply unsettling rhythm, metallic knocking from within the ship. Sailors trapped in pockets of air were striking the steel with whatever they had. Outside, other men heard it, and knew exactly what it meant. Improvised rescue teams began cutting into the hull. There were no plans. No ideal tools. Only urgency. Every opening could save a life, or let in too much water and kill those still holding on inside. In some cases the rescues came in time. In others the knocking stopped before anyone could reach them. Those decisions stayed with the men who had to make them, forever. On other ships the fight was against fire. Improvised hoses were passed from hand to hand. Exhausted men kept working even while wounded, because stopping felt worse than continuing. Some sailors collapsed from exhaustion. Others simply sat down on deck, staring into nothing, unable to process what they had seen. The USS West Virginia and the USS California were sinking slowly, settling onto the bottom of the harbor. Their crews continued to operate valves, isolate compartments, and pull out the wounded until the very last possible moment. It was not conscious heroism, it was responsibility. Many stayed aboard knowing they might not make it out. The water of the harbor became a place of paradox. In some areas it was refuge. In others, a deadly trap. Oil leaking from burning ships formed a black film on the surface. One spark was enough to turn water into fire. Some sailors managed to swim beneath that layer, holding their breath to escape the flames. Others never had the chance. Throughout the morning, small boats began moving through the harbor, picking up the wounded, carrying them ashore, improvising aid stations. Doctors and nurses worked without pause, often without proper supplies. Bandages were made from whatever was available. Morphine ran out quickly. Fatigue was ignored. On shore the feeling was just as surreal. Many sailors, covered in oil and soot, wandered aimlessly, looking for their ships, or what was left of them. Some asked about friends who were already dead without knowing it. Others simply sat in silence, staring out at the harbor. Only gradually did the scale of the disaster become clear. Ships destroyed or gravely damaged. Hundreds dead. Thousands wounded. And above all, the certainty that this had not been an accident, nor an isolated attack. It was the beginning of something far larger. For the men who survived, the question that began to form was not strategic. It was intimate. How could everything change so fast? When night fell over Pearl Harbor, silence returned, but it was not peace. It was exhaustion. The sailors who had spent the entire morning running, fighting fires, pulling the wounded from the water, and listening to knocking from overturned hulls were now still, sitting wherever they could, staring out at the darkened harbor. Smoke still rose in uneven columns. The smell of oil and burned metal lingered in the air, too heavy to ignore. For many it was in that moment, and not during the attack, that Pearl Harbor truly hit them. Without the roar of aircraft, without shouted orders, without explosions, the thoughts arrived. The images the body had postponed came rushing back. The questions no one wanted to ask out loud surfaced. Where is that friend? Who else didn't make it out of the ship? Why did I survive? Across the harbor, searchlights swept the water throughout the night. No one knew if the enemy might return. Rumors spread. False alarms were frequent. Any unfamiliar sound made men rise instantly, bracing for another wave of attacks. No one truly slept that night. On partially intact ships, sailors stood watch at improvised positions, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the dark sky. On shore, hospitals and makeshift infirmaries continued to receive the wounded. Many doctors and nurses worked for more than 24 hours straight, without rest, without knowing how many more would arrive. The dead began to be gathered. Bodies covered with tarps were laid out in improvised areas. Identification was not always possible. In some cases all that remained was a number, a fragment of uniform, a vague memory of where that man had served. For those who had to recognize friends or bunkmates, the process was devastating. Among the sailors a shared feeling began to surface: guilt. Guilt for not arriving in time. Guilt for abandoning a compartment engulfed in flames. Guilt for being alive when others were not. This weight does not appear in official reports. But it appears again and again in personal accounts written years later. Many men would carry Pearl Harbor with them for the rest of their lives, not just as a memory of war but as a personal breaking point. That night, clearer information also began to circulate. Japanese aircraft. A coordinated attack. War. For many sailors, hearing this brought a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief at finally having a name for the enemy. Fear at realizing that this would not end here. The next day would bring speeches, orders, reorganization. But that night belonged only to them. Young men sitting by the water's edge, looking at ships that hours earlier had been their home and were now graves or burned-out hulks. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others simply remained silent, because there were no words big enough. Pearl Harbor did not end when the planes flew away. It ended when the men understood that there was no going back. December 8, 1941, dawned unlike any day those sailors had ever known. The sun rose over a wounded naval base, covered in lingering smoke, debris and a heavy, oppressive silence. There was no surprise now. There was work. From the earliest hours, men returned to the ships, or to what remained of them. Some stepped back onto the same decks where they had fought only hours before. Others were assigned to different vessels, improvised ones because their ships no longer existed as operational units. The Navy had to reorganize quickly, and those men were all that remained. The hard routine of recovery began. Smoldering fires were finally extinguished. Flooded compartments were pumped dry. Bodies were still being found, sometimes trapped in places no one had been able to reach the day before. Each discovery brought an automatic hush to the area, a brief, involuntary pause, before the work resumed. There was no time for prolonged mourning. For many sailors, physically returning to the ships was harder than the attack itself. Now, with the immediate danger gone, they had to face the marks left behind. Holes torn through hulls, twisted turrets, personal belongings scattered where order had once existed. Empty bunks spoke more clearly than any casualty list. Even so, the response was swift, and almost fierce. Ships that seemed beyond saving were prepared for salvage. The USS Nevada, beached to avoid blocking the channel, began to be stabilized. The USS West Virginia and USS California, settled on the harbor bottom, would eventually be refloated. This was not just naval engineering, it was the recovery of morale. Every ship saved was a silent answer to the attack. Among the men, something had changed as well. Shock gave way to a hard determination. Many accounts describe a clear feeling that day: this will not stand. It wasn't political rhetoric. It was personal. Every sailor who had seen friends die felt he now carried an obligation that hadn't existed before. As the day went on, news from outside began to arrive. The president would speak to Congress. The word war ceased to be a possibility and became an official reality. For the men at Pearl Harbor, this didn't change what they felt. They had already been at war since the previous morning. What it changed was meaning. Now everything had a name, a declared enemy, a path forward. The emotional chaos of the first hours began to settle into something colder, more functional. Many sailors asked to remain on active duty. Others, wounded, insisted on returning as soon as they could. Few wanted to be sent away. The idea of leaving while others stayed behind felt unbearable. Pearl Harbor had created, in a matter of hours, a generation of combatants. Men who days earlier had been thinking about leave and quiet routines were now talking about repairs, fleet redistribution, and future missions. Not out of enthusiasm but because there was no psychological alternative. Standing still meant returning to that Sunday, and no one wanted to relive it. As the days passed, the base slowly began to rise again. The destruction was still visible, but the constant movement of men and machines sent a clear message. The attack had not paralyzed the Navy. It had, instead, awakened something that did not yet have a shape, but already had force. For the sailors who lived through it from inside the ships, Pearl Harbor came to exist in two distinct times. The before, calm, predictable, almost naive. And the after, hard, watchful, stripped of illusions. As the war spread across the Pacific, the men who had survived Pearl Harbor carried something invisible with them. It wasn't a badge or a medal. It was an internalized memory, a constant awareness of the sky, an automatic reaction to the sound of engines, an early understanding that war at sea does not give warning. On new ships, in new fleets, many of those sailors returned to combat only months later. But everything felt different now. Drills were no longer routine, they were real preparation. Alarms were no longer an annoyance, they were an invitation to survive. What had been learned the hard way on that Sunday morning now guided every movement. On the aircraft carriers that pushed across the Pacific, on cruisers and destroyers escorting convoys, There were men who remembered exactly the moment the waters of Pearl Harbor began to boil with explosions. They didn't need speeches to understand what was at stake. For them, the war already had a face, the faces of friends who had never made it off their ships. Later combat reports reveal a clear pattern. Pearl Harbor survivors tended to act with a calm urgency. They didn't panic easily. They didn't dismiss warnings. Many officers noticed this without fully understanding it. The explanation lay in that first shock, experienced without preparation and without context. Pearl Harbor had taught, brutally, that danger arrives precisely when you believe you are safe. Through battles like the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and so many others, these men recognized sounds, smells, and sensations that took them straight back to that morning. Some said that during the first air attack they faced afterward, their bodies reacted before their minds, exactly as they had in 1941. But there was also an emotional weight. Many sailors carried a persistent sense of debt. A quiet obligation to keep going for those who hadn't survived. This doesn't appear in official reports, but it surfaces again and again in letters and later testimonies. For them, the war was not just duty, it was continuation. When victory finally came years later, Pearl Harbor was not erased. It wasn't replaced by other memories. It remained the point of origin, the place where everything began abruptly, chaotically, unfairly. Returning to civilian life, many of these men discovered something unexpected. It was difficult to explain Pearl Harbor to those who hadn't been there. Not because of a lack of words, but because the experience didn't follow a clear narrative. There was no orderly beginning, no understandable middle, no immediate end. There was only the sudden collapse of normal life. Some spoke very little about it. Others spoke too much. Many spoke only among themselves. As the decades passed, veterans' reunions revealed a curious pattern. It took only one person mentioning that morning for the atmosphere to change. Nothing more needed to be said. Everyone knew exactly what it meant. Because Pearl Harbor, for them, was not a historical event. It was an internal place. A moment frozen in time, where the old world ended and another began without warning. A point to which memory returned uninvited, even after an entire life had been lived beyond the war. There is only one way left to close this story, not with strategy or politics, but with what remains when everything else fades. Human memory. As the years passed, Pearl Harbor began to change form, not physically but in the way it lived inside the men who survived it. For many of them, the attack stopped being only a traumatic memory and became a fixed point of identity. Something that shaped decisions, silences, and even how they saw the world. Some sailors stayed in the Navy and made it a career. Others left as soon as they could. But regardless of the path they took, Pearl Harbor went with them. On anniversaries, in occasional headlines, in official ceremonies, the memory returned. Sometimes in a controlled way. Sometimes without warning. When the USS Arizona Memorial was inaugurated, many veterans felt conflicted. For some, it brought relief, a visible acknowledgement that the sacrifice had not been forgotten. For others, walking across that quiet structure above the sunken hull was difficult. Looking down and knowing that men they had shared meals, watches, and laughter with were still there, sealed below, demanded a different kind of strength than combat ever had. Among the survivors there was an unspoken understanding. Pearl Harbor did not belong only to national history, it belonged to them. It was something lived, not studied. When they heard simplified versions, clean maps, precise timelines, colored arrows, many felt that something essential was missing. None of that showed what it was like to wake up with the ship shaking. None of it captured the smell, the heat, the fear of not finding a way out. That is why, when they spoke about people. About the shipmate who stayed at his gun even after being wounded. About the petty officer who helped others escape and never came back. About the strange silence afterward, when the attack ended and no one knew what to say. These details rarely appear in textbooks, but they are what sustained the real memory of the attack. Over time the men grew old. Reunions became less frequent. Empty chairs began to multiply. Each year fewer voices could say, "I was there." And that placed a new weight on those who remained. The sense that they carried not only their own memories, but also the memories of many who could no longer tell theirs. For these sailors, Pearl Harbor was never just the beginning of America's war. It was the abrupt end of a collective innocence. The moment they understood, irrevocably, that geographic distance does not guarantee safety, and that war can cross oceans in silence. Today, when the harbor is calm and visitors walk through the memorials, it is easy to forget the chaos of that morning. But for those who were on the ships, the tranquil water has always carried another image beneath it. Floating wreckage, burning oil, men struggling to breathe. That coexistence, between a serene present and a violent past, is part of the human legacy of Pearl Harbor. Only one step remains to close this story, to bring all of this together in a final reflection that speaks not of airplanes or strategy, but of the lasting meaning of having lived the attack from inside the ships. Even months after the attack, Pearl Harbor had not ended for the men who were there. The war moved forward, but the harbor remained a silent worksite, where the recent past had to be pulled, literally, from the bottom before the future could advance. For many surviving sailors, remaining at Pearl Harbor after the attack was a strange and heavy experience. While new battles unfolded across the Pacific, they lived every day among the wreckage of what had been destroyed that December morning. Forgetting was impossible. Every step, every watch, every glance at the water brought it back. Salvage operations began almost immediately. Ships the world believed lost began, slowly, to return to the surface. The USS West Virginia, the USS California, and other battleships were pumped out, sealed, stabilized. The work was slow, technical, and dangerous. Divers descended into dark compartments filled with mud, oil, and human remains. Many would later say that this work was emotionally harder than the attack itself. In some places, personal items were still found: helmets, letters, simple utensils. Each object was a reminder that the twisted steel had been a home only hours before. For sailors who recognized these items, the shock was unavoidable. The past was not distant, it was right there, just a few meters below the surface. The USS Arizona, however, would not be raised. The explosion had been final. The ship remained where it fell, becoming, already during the war, a place of quiet respect. Many survivors avoided looking directly at it. Others paused for a few seconds in complete silence before returning to work. It wasn't a conscious choice, it was instinct. Meanwhile, new sailors arrived at the base. Young men who had not lived through the attack now served alongside those who carried it in their eyes. Between them, a subtle division formed. Not of rank, but of experience. Those who had been there on December 7th saw Pearl Harbor differently. For them, the base was not just strategic, it was living memory. This coexistence between immediate past and ongoing war shaped the behavior of the Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor became a permanent warning. Training was taken seriously with almost obsessive intensity. Alarms were treated as real. Drills were never dismissed as empty routine. The attack had taught something that could not be unlearned. And even as the United States advanced across the Pacific, retaking territory, winning decisive battles, Pearl Harbor remained as an emotional point of origin. Many sailors said that every new mission was, in some way, a delayed response to that morning. But something even deeper was happening. As time passed, Pearl Harbor stopped being only a personal memory and began to turn into collective memory. Speeches, ceremonies, and symbols emerged. Yet for the men who were on the ships, there was always a difference between what was publicly remembered and what had actually been lived. That tension, between official memory and human experience, is essential to understanding why Pearl Harbor was never just a historical event. As the years passed, something delicate began to happen to Pearl Harbor. The experience lived by the sailors started to be translated into symbols. Official speeches began to compress the attack into powerful phrases. Fixed dates, precise times, consolidated numbers. The expression, "a day that will live in infamy," took on a life of its own. For the nation, this was necessary. Collective memory needs shape, shared language, a point of unity. For the men who were on the ships, however, this transformation was ambiguous. Many understood the importance of remembrance. They knew the dead deserved to be honored and that the country needed to understand what had happened. Still, there was a quiet discomfort in seeing that morning arranged into clean narratives, when for them it had been fragmented, chaotic, and profoundly human. Some veterans were invited to speak at schools, ceremonies, and public events. When they accepted, they quickly discovered the difficulty. How do you explain the attack without oversimplifying it? How do you tell the truth without turning horror into spectacle? Many ended up focusing on small details, a gesture, a split-second decision, a moment of mutual help, because that was where the real experience still lived. Others chose silence. Not out of forgetting, but out of respect for what cannot be easily translated. For these men, Pearl Harbor was not something that could be fully told. It was something you carried. And carrying it in silence sometimes felt more honest than explaining it. Over time, the USS Arizona Memorial became a point where this tension converged. For the public, it was a place of tribute and reflection. For survivors, it was also a place of internal confrontation. Walking above the sunken hull meant accepting that a part of their own lives had remained there, frozen in 1941. Some veterans went once. Others returned whenever they could. Some could never bring themselves to go. There was no right or wrong. Only different ways of living with the same wound. Among them, one feeling appeared again and again. That Pearl Harbor was the moment when the world revealed its fragility. Many said that after that day, they never fully trusted routines, promises of safety, or the idea that nothing will happen. Not out of paranoia, but out of hard-earned understanding. That understanding was often passed on without words. Children and grandchildren grew up noticing small signs. A veteran who always sat with his back to the wall, another who woke at the slightest noise, another who fell into complete silence every December 7th. Pearl Harbor lived on in these minimal gestures. As the decades went by and the number of survivors diminished, a new concern emerged among them. Who would tell the story when no one remained who had been there? Not the official version, that would always exist, but the human one, made of confusion, fear, improvisation, and solidarity. That is why many already elderly chose to speak. Not to correct textbooks but to add layers. To leave it recorded that Pearl Harbor was not just a successful attack or a strategic failure. It was an experience lived second by ordinary men, in confined spaces under impossible decisions. And that is the layer we still need to explore more deeply. What Pearl Harbor became as the survivors themselves began to disappear, and how their memory came to depend entirely on those willing to listen. We move forward because this story is not finished yet. When the voices began to grow fewer, Pearl Harbor entered a new phase, the phase of listening. The sailors who had lived through the attack grew old. Many spent decades without speaking publicly about that morning. Others spoke only what was strictly necessary. But as they began to sense that time was closing in, something changed. Not out of vanity, nor from a desire for recognition. It changed out of responsibility. They knew that when they were gone, Pearl Harbor risked becoming only a well-dated, well-explained event, and a deeply misunderstood one. It was during this period that interviews began to be recorded with greater urgency. Museums, universities, and oral history projects started preserving long testimonies, often filled with pauses, silences, and unexpected detours. And it was then that something became clear. The human truth of Pearl Harbor did not fit into a timeline. One veteran would begin by talking about a torpedo, and end by talking about the smell of coffee he never got to drink. Another would describe the explosion, and then fall silent for minutes, trying to remember the face of a shipmate whose name had slipped away. These accounts were not organized. They did not follow a didactic logic. But they were real. And together they formed something no report could ever provide, the texture of the experience. Many of these men said the same thing in different words. People think they understand Pearl Harbor. But understanding is not knowing what happened. It's knowing what it was like to be there. For them, the attack was not remembered as a single moment, but as a fragmented sequence that never fully came together. A sound here. A decision there. A blocked corridor. A staircase that saved a life. A delay of seconds that took another. As these voices were archived, something curious happened. Pearl Harbor stopped being only a national narrative and began to be recognized as a mosaic of individual experiences. There was no single story, there were thousands coexisting. And that changed the way the attack began to be taught, remembered, and discussed. The exclusive focus on strategic failures gave way to human questions. How do ordinary people react when the world collapses without warning? How do you make the right decisions with no information at all? How do you carry this for the rest of your life? For those who listen to these testimonies today, one detail appears again and again. Almost no sailor describes himself as a hero. They speak of fear, confusion, improvisation. They speak of helping because someone needed help. They speak of surviving by chance. Heroism, if it exists, appears later, in the eyes of those who listen, not in the words of those who lived it. And perhaps that is why these stories matter so much. Because they prevent Pearl Harbor from being reduced to a rigid symbol. They remind us that behind every ship that was hit, there were men waking in terror, trying to understand what was happening and doing the best they could under impossible circumstances. Now, when nearly all of those voices have fallen silent, the responsibility they felt at the end of their lives falls to us. To listen carefully. We have not yet reached the end of this narrative. But we are close to its most delicate point of all. The moment when history stops belonging to those who lived it, and begins to depend entirely on those who choose to remember. We continue. In the end, Pearl Harbor does not belong only to written history. It belongs to human memory, the kind that can never fully fit into dates, maps, or speeches. For the men who were aboard the ships that Sunday morning, the attack was never an event. It was an experience. something felt in the body before it was understood by the mind. A moment when routine shattered without warning, and decisions made in seconds determined who would return home and who would remain forever on the bottom of the harbor. These sailors did not see the attack from above. They saw it from inside. They felt the deck shake beneath their feet. They watched corridors fill with smoke. They saw friends vanish in explosions that allowed no time for goodbyes. And still they did what they could. Not out of calculated heroism, but because someone beside them needed help. Because standing still was not an option. Because surviving in that moment was a collective act. As the years passed, nearly all of those voices fell silent. The men grew old, passed away, and Pearl Harbor came to exist mostly as a memorial, a quiet place visited by people who walk slowly, look into the water, and try to imagine what happened there. But imagining is not the same as living. That is why telling Pearl Harbor through the eyes of the men who were on the ships matters so deeply. Because it prevents history from becoming comfortable. Because it reminds us that war does not begin with declarations. It begins with surprise, fear, and confusion. Because it restores humanity to numbers that, on their own, say nothing. Today the harbor is calm. The sky is clear. The water reflects the sun like on any other day. And yet, beneath that tranquil surface rest ships, memories, and men who never left. The USS Arizona Memorial marks that silence permanently, not as a triumph but as remembrance. Pearl Harbor was the beginning of a war for a nation. But for those sailors, it was the abrupt end of a familiar world. They went on fighting. They went on living. They went on moving forward. But they never truly left that harbor. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember Pearl Harbor. Not as a distant symbol, but as the sum of thousands of human stories lived in a matter of minutes. Stories that continue to exist as long as someone is willing to listen. Here the narrative ends. Not with a definitive answer, but with memory.